Tana koutou katoa, welcome, salam, and I'm very happy to be in your presence to start the first of the series of Voices of Women of Afghanistan. The reason that we have started this, and I am very proud to have a privilege to have three amazing speakers today to start the first panel with. But the reason that we decided to have this discussion today is the dire situation in Afghanistan. As you know, in August 2021, the Taliban took over Afghanistan for the second time. And the country has been suffering from that moment with severe hunger, poverty, political mismanagement, series of armed struggles, militias attacking different places, but also through security challenges and gradual genocide of the Hazara people. These are all multiplied by economic instability, diplomatic isolation of Afghanistan, and many of the very amazing, talented students and workers and employment who can no longer work. But most significantly, however, has been the unchallenged and brutal violation of the rights of women and girls from accessing education, healthcare, economic opportunities, employment. So this has created a much dire situation and has exacerbated the security challenges in Afghanistan. It's not only a factor that contributes or has a negative impact on the situation of women in Afghanistan, but it also has a detrimental impact on the security of Afghanistan in general, on progress and stability of the country. The Taliban has been ensuring the security, the elimination of women and girls from society, from spaces, public spaces, recently, as you know, from education. The first panel discussion is dedicated to women of Afghanistan, and I think we have three amazing speakers for the panel who can tell you teach us a lot about what is the situation in Afghanistan and how can we help, what are the situation, and we hear firsthand from their voices. So our first amazing speaker is Dr. Farkhonda Akbari. Dr. Farkhonda Akbari is a postgraduate research fellow at Gender, Peace and Security Center at Monash University in Australia. She focuses on diplomatic negotiation with extreme non-state armed actors, peace processes, and women, peace and security agenda, and a lot of amazing work as well as advocacy for Afghani women, human rights, and the rights of women and girls to education and healthcare. Dr. Farkhonda obtained her PhD in diplomatic studies from Australian National University. Her thesis examined the required characteristic for non-state armed actors to engage meaningfully in diplomacy for the purpose of peace settlement, and looked at the cases of the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Khmer Rouge. Today, Farkhonda is going to talk to us about Taliban ideology, the foundations and the policies that they have imposed on Afghanistan, and the existing situation that we are facing. So without further ado, Dr. Farkhonda, very welcome to our panel. Please start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nigar, Massey University, Dr. Athar, and other colleagues who have been helping in putting this webinar, and also providing your very precious platform to echo the voice of women of Afghanistan. I'm also grateful to share the panel with my dear friend Azada Jan and Parisa Jan, from both of whom I take inspiration for my work. As you mentioned, Doctor, about what I will be talking about, the three key issues I thought to focus more. First, reflecting on the Taliban's gender apartheid regime. You listed the restrictions that the Taliban have imposed on women in Afghanistan. The Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021 also meant reversing fundamental rights for women, of all of fundamental human rights, but especially women rights in all over Afghanistan in the fastest pace that we have ever seen. There were works done post-conflict, post-2001, that my colleague might reflect on those gains and achievements. But what we have saw in the last 1.5 years, the reversion or the reversing of all these rights in such a fast-paced ways, as mentioned, as fundamental as not allowing girls beyond grade 6 to be educated, women's employment, all forms of employment apart from healthcare, and healthcare itself as well. I mean, there are very complicated and contesting sort of practices going on in the country about women's work in the healthcare. But then women are stripped of all other fundamental rights of who they are. And in many ways, the Taliban's policies of gender apartheid against women in Afghanistan is worse than what we have seen other forms of apartheid, such as the racial apartheid we saw in South Africa, which sort of ignited some of the most significant global social movement of the 20th centuries, bringing countries together to fight against it. Apartheid, why I call it gender apartheid, I mean, apartheid itself means or refer to separatedness, something that separates you from the other. But the Taliban policies against women is, in many ways, we can say it's even worse than apartheid. It's dehumanizing women to an extent where their ability and their functionality as a human is being limited, being disabled. Afghanistan is unfortunately in the year 2023, right now as we speak, is in its darkest place for women and girls, by far worse than many other extremist Islamist groups that we have seen. A recent study I did with some other colleagues from other universities, we looked at, for example, ISIS, and we compared, and Taliban's policies on women employment and education is even worse than ISIS policies or gender policies. So all of these sort of tell us that in right now, in the background, there has been so much work being done on women, peace and security, so much work being done on international norms for gender equality. We are observing and digesting, and to some extent accommodating a regime such as the Taliban regime that institutes or reinstitutes a gender apartheid. Doctor, you also mentioned the social restrictions, right? And I alluded to it, but how these restrictions are impacting women's agency in their homes, within their families. There is a multi-level power game going on in Afghanistan, starting from home to village, to province, to cities, and to the country, about women's agency, women's existence. It is a taxi driver deciding by looking what you're wearing, whether you could be his passenger, to take you to that 43 mile that you're allowed to travel, or your guardian, be it your brother, your father, your uncle, to allow you to visit, to go to a certain place with them. Or as a consequences, I think it's much more silent. That we don't know. There's not, I mean, with the collapse of the Republican system and the collapse of the civil society, we do not have many sources on the ground or many voices from the ground to come out. We know about abduction, about Taliban's restriction on journalists, on silencing voices. But from Afghanistan, I mean, we as an Afghan from outside, we with our families and friends living in the country, apart from our professional network, we do hear about these sort of consequences on daily lives. There are many forced marriages of my own cousins. My uncle was telling my mother the other day that, oh, I have to marry off my daughter because the situation is so bad that I cannot take care of her anymore if she does something. She was going to university before, she was engaged in civil society, but now she's just at home. Okay, what does she do? She has to be married on. Or the cases of young women committing suicides that we hear. Much of them goes unreported, but we still hear how many of these young women take their own lives just because they do not see any light at the end of the tunnel. There are a lot to talk about, but because of the sake of the time, I will go to the next point about the Taliban ideology. The Taliban do know the cost of these restrictions that they're imposing on women. Things such as unfreeze of the fund are being conditional because of their policies on women. The Taliban's diplomatic recognition is being, to an extent, conditioned by their policies on women. But why do they still do these things? I think for here we need to sort of reflect or talk about the Taliban ideology. The Taliban is an extremist ideological group who have their gender policies is a very big part of the Taliban ideology. It's who they are, and they cannot detach themselves from these sort of ideological stance that they have had. They propagated against. They burned schools for 20 years. And they sort of look back at their ideal time of ruling Afghanistan from the mid 1990s to mid 2021, or at least September, October 2021, that an emirate was in place, and these were the things that they did before, and they used those practices to propagate to their foot soldiers, to their supporters, that using narratives such as liberal democracy, human rights, women's participation in politics, in society, as a way to justify their jihad. So that's why the Taliban's gender policy has become a big part of their ideology and their practices since the takeover, even though the political side of the Taliban or the political wing do understand the consequences and the cost that they are paying. We do know about the sort of the conflict between different parts of the Taliban movement about allowing girls to school, and the Kabul and the political side, and then the Kandahar clerics, and including their supreme leader being much more strict, that no, we have to continue what we have said, which is enhancing this sort of ideological stand, which by then mean restriction of women. I can go back to it later in the Q&A if there was question. I have there's again a lot more to unpack, and I don't have time. And then thirdly, a political call for action. Why I thought it is important to talk about this, because why are we, as an international community, with so much norms in place and so much sort of social and political work being done towards gender equality, we still have a regime such as the Taliban regime, and we're talking about how to accommodate them in the international community? Unfortunately, there has been a lack of cohesive voice from the international community to take a principled approach towards the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. When the Doha Agreement was signed in 29th of February 2021, we did know that the Taliban are being emboldened and legitimized through that agreement, and they are eventually going to come to power. And what did it mean? The Taliban's gender policies, and nobody said anything about it. and why why the international community is being silent. We also remember the narrative that were used in 9/11 on the eves of 9/11, that the international community, the NATO supported countries are going to Afghanistan to unveil Afghan women, to support human rights, New Zealand included, Australia included, even though they were not NATO members. But there was this sort of moral obligation that they felt. Why? Because it was political and military intervention was justified by this human right narrative. But then what about now, 20 years later, that women in Afghanistan, they're paying the price. They did poured their heart and soul to the post-2001 of liberal democratic sort of Afghanistan, but and then they were sold off in the Doha Agreement with the Taliban coming to power, and whatever that women in Afghanistan are going through right now, I think everybody has an obligation, especially countries who contributed militarily to Afghanistan. There's much more. There's a moral stand, and they will be haunted if not now. If I can't do it, or us from Afghanistan can't do it, I think the citizens of every other country who had their governments contributing troops in Afghanistan do need to take them accountable for what the women and girls are going through in Afghanistan under the gender apartheid. I will stop here, and I'm happy to take questions later on what I have said to be more clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was amazing, and I can speak and ask you questions for hours. This is amazing, and I'm very grateful that you raised that question, because how many women participated in that contract of Doha Agreement? How many Afghani women were in the meeting, or American women? It's a very problematic process that we have internationally, that we still don't have women participation in peace processes. So thank you very much for speaking.